Welcome back to Detective TV. Let's continue to come to the next part of the story of Medellín Cartel. Chapter 2. The Empire Rises and the Bloody War. The army of assassins and the prayer before the execution. Beyond the chief architects, the Medellín Cartel was a complex machine with specialists for every dark task. The cartel's finances and business relations were managed by Gustavo Gaviria and Roberto Escobar, Pablo's older brother, who had worked for years in accounting. Alongside them, a formidable armed wing was formed, featuring terrifying figures like La Kika, Popeye, XX, El Negro, Angelito, El Chopo, El Palomo, and many others. They were all part of the cartel's security forces and armies of assassins, through which the Medellín leadership established a balance of power to control and dominate the drug trade. They were all trained by Yair Klein, owner of the private military company Hadahanit, a buddy of Carlos Leder whom I mentioned earlier. It was reported that by the end of the 1980s, the cartel had more than 2,000 trained fighters. The most famous cartel enforcer these days is probably Popeye, nicknamed for his resemblance to the cartoon character. Like others, he put forward his own version of who truly ran the Medellín Cartel. According to him, it was Jorge Ochoa. It was his instructions that Pablo Escobar obeyed. Popeye only died in 2020, having lived an eventful life. He managed to serve 23 years in prison for confessing to 257 contract murders and participating in the preparation of more than 3,000 murders. He also managed to write memoirs, run a YouTube channel, and even in our time, managed to get sent back to prison after his release. He blackmailed important people like Jorge Ochoa, who were previously associated with the cartel, hoping to get money. It didn't work out, and he died in custody in 2020. Less well-known is a militant faction of the Medellín Cartel called Los Priscos, led by the Prisco brothers, Armando, Alberto, Diaz El Negro, Jose Rodolfo, and David Ricardo. In 1980, David Prisco, also known as Chino, was arrested and convicted of carjacking. After his release, he was recruited into the Medellín Cartel at the behest of Escobar. In its heyday, the group consisted of about 100 professional fighters. David Prisco, in the spirit of all Medellín traffickers, was popular with the ordinary people of his Aranjuez neighborhood. He opened an account at the local supermarket for those who could not buy groceries, and he also paid university tuition for local children. The brothers had a statue of Saint Virgin del Carmen in their home, and as eyewitnesses recount, they jointly offered a prayer to her before every business venture. And there were many cases. The Prisco family were involved in all major actions of the cartel, and they are attributed to at least 200 contract political assassinations. Their names were published in the press after the assassination of the Minister of Justice, and they were forced to leave Medellín. The criminal group was gradually dismantled from 1987 to 1991. In 1991, David Prisco was killed on the same day as his brother in two separate police operations in Medellín and Rio Negro. The crack hurricane and the specter of extradition. By 1982, the Medellín bosses were doing well. The cartel's production centers were in the south of the country, in the eastern plains, and in the provinces of Meta and Caqueta. One of the largest full-cycle cocaine production and processing centers in the world, called Tranquilandia, was operating here, producing several hundred kilograms a day. Not surprisingly, such a scale could not help but attract the attention of the Americans. To keep prices high, the Medellín Cartel put exactly that much product on the market so that its price would not drop, and they were making great profits. By 1982, a kilogram of cocaine in Medellín was being purchased for $8,000, and in Miami it was being sold for $42,000. At the same time, the Americans began to shut down the Bahamian transportation route, and Norman's Cay, under Leder's leadership, was no longer providing the necessary flow of traffic. The drug businessmen began looking for options and eventually found a way through Mexico. The opening of Mexican channels led to the market being oversaturated and the price per kilogram predictably fell, but this would lead to the appearance of a new drug on the streets of the United States: crack. Crack would not only become a real marginal symbol of the American ghetto, but would also lead the Medellín Cartel to even more staggering profits. The price per kilogram would drop, but it would open a vast new market. An interesting fact: in Colombia itself, cocaine was not very popular in the 80s. Firstly, as the price dropped, it remained expensive for the average Colombian. Secondly, Colombians switched to smoking cocaine paste, bazuco, which had the effect of instant addiction and a killing effect. Both Carlos Leder and Griselda Blanco became victims of bazuco. One of the few deterrents to the Medellín narcos was the extradition law. A 1979 bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Colombia had been ratified by both sides by 1981, but few people paid attention to it at the time. By 1982, however, the cocaine kings, with the growth of the organization, realized that the agreement concerned them directly. The main threat lurked in Article 8. Drug smugglers were subject to extradition to the U.S. even if they had never left Colombia. All that was required was to prove that they posed a danger to the U.S., that is, that they were supplying drugs to the United States. And each of them had already been on the radar of the DEA, which however did not fully understand how large the organization had grown and that it was a cohesive group and not a collection of local tsars. Section 8 of the Extradition Act meant that U.S. prosecutors could demand the extradition of anyone involved in drug trafficking. In the early 80s, after the battles on the streets of Miami that made history as the Cocaine Cowboy Wars, agents zealously began working in Colombia. The DEA realized that the big dealers feared American prisons like fire, so they preferred to operate from the safety of Colombia. Muerte a secuestradores, the first declaration of war. The faces of drug kingpins like Carlos Leder gradually began to flash across the headlines, and for years they had worked hard to build a screen of integrity. But it wasn't just their neighbors to the north who were watching the growing power of the cartel. In Colombia at that time, the terrorist left-wing group M19 was active, one of these areas of activity of which was the kidnapping of wealthy businessmen for ransom. On November 12, 1981, Martha Nieves Ochoa Vasquez, one of the Ochoa clan, was kidnapped while leaving the university. For her release, M19 demanded $12 million from the cartel. However, in response, the Ochoa brothers created a special armed unit called Muerte a secuestradores, death to the kidnappers, which began exterminating the rebels. Guillermo Alacio Ruiz, one of the leaders of M19, and his family were among those killed by cartel fighters. In February 1982, the rebels released Martha Ochoa, effectively admitting defeat and made peace with the cartel. As a result of the war, M19 was forced out of the densely populated and wealthy province of Antioquia. This was the first, but by no means the last, time the Medellín Cartel would use paramilitary forces. In 1981, the Colombian cocaine kings held a summit on the Caribbean coast. The location was Jorge Ochoa's ranch, the Hacienda Veracruz. Further expansion of the cocaine business was on the agenda. The Ochoa clan had accumulated so much cocaine that they were looking for more and more ways to ship the drug abroad. Carlos Leder was the guest of honor at the meeting. His position on Norman's Cay was still strong, but he, like the others, realized that the capacity of the tiny island was no longer able to meet the increased demand in the American market. The dealers lacked airplanes, pilots, and most importantly, new smuggling routes. At Veracruz, the young drug kingpins solidified mutually beneficial ties and agreed, through a mutual friend, one Mata Ballesteros, to begin cooperation with the Mexicans. The cartel grew by leaps and bounds, but it would not become a truly international organization until a few years later when the cooperation with Escobar, Gacha, and Ochoa would become unprecedented, and the Mexican godfather Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo would fully join the business. Plata o plomo, bribing and intimidating the political stage. The consolidation of this alliance within the country was accompanied by endless bloodshed. The Medellín police were powerless to stop the violence and killings. In 1982, the city became the fiefdom of the cocaine kings. Police and politicians took bribes and kept their mouths shut. Otherwise, death awaited them. The law of plata o plomo, silver or lead, worked much better than the extradition treaty. A new era of the drug trade had dawned. Instead of loners, it was the pack. Money was flowing into the city, and they were spending it in a race. At first, it was quite difficult to distinguish drug kings from other idle rich people. Pablo Escobar loved auto racing. Rodriguez Gacha became the unofficial patron and major employer of his native Pacho. The Ochoa clan continued the old business of breeding pedigree horses and bulls, but on an unprecedented scale. They literally bought the entire niche of bullfighting, a popular entertainment in Colombia. Carlos let her build a hotel in Armenia called La Posada El Mana. It had 24 luxurious rooms in Swiss style, a restaurant, a conference center, a nightclub with an observation deck, a mini zoo with lions, and a wine cellar with a collection of fine drinks from all over the world. In front of the hotel was a monument to a naked John Lennon, and touching him was considered a good omen among smugglers. Letter bought up residential houses, buildings of state institutions, and private firms in his native Armenia, which led to increased prices in land plots. He was often seen walking around in a knight's helmet and boots, and his hand was often raised in a Nazi salute. Letter also became interested in publishing. He had his own newspaper with a huge circulation called Quindio Libra. It was printed in green ink and proclaimed a marijuana civilization with a little bit of Nazism. Pablo Escobar, by the way, was not very fond of Letter because of his now obvious addiction to smoking bazuco. Plus, Letter was talking nonsense at every turn, then shouted fascist slogans, then boasted that he had donated a lot of money to the Liberal Party to support a presidential candidate. In this way, he publicly linked his name and the names of his fellow smugglers to the Colombian political system, which is why he made the headlines often. Of course, the cartel sought to influence the upper echelons of power, but only Letter bragged about it, attracting attention. Escobar called him Bocon, which means big mouth, but his connections and contacts were still important to the organization. Letter, of course, behaved unwisely, but Escobar himself surpassed everyone and everything. It was not for nothing that he became the formal leader of the entire organization in the eyes of the public. In the 1982 elections, Escobar made an incredibly brazen act. He officially passed the Colombian Congress as an understudy. The richest drug trafficker became a congressman. 1982 was an election year, and the extradition law was keeping the drug traffickers busy. At one of the meetings, Rodriguez Gacha made it clear that his contacts in the opposition party had good news. Conservative Party candidate Belisario Betancourt had personally confirmed to one of his lawyers that if he won, he had no intention of extraditing Colombian citizens to the United States. Escobar, however, had his men in the other party and was betting on the liberals. Carlos Letter, in his book, tells us they fought with all the forces of the cartel to cancel the extradition. Pablo won a seat in Congress as a deputy and began supporting the campaign of candidate Lopez. Pablo arranged a meeting with candidate Lopez, who agreed on the condition that the meeting be held in privacy. The day before, Pablo Escobar summoned the other bosses to his office. He suggested that they each donate $100,000. Then Lopez arrived and confidently stated that the extradition treaty would remain under study, and he did not believe it would be enforced anytime soon. Pablo tactfully mentioned the donation we were going to give him and said the support would continue. A couple of days later, Letter got a call from a frustrated Pablo Escobar. "Come on, Carlos, I need your help. These bastard politicians have already betrayed us. They took $800,000 from us, and now they're laughing at us. Do something, Carlos." It turned out that Lopez's campaign staff had assured the press that they would turn over the drug traffickers. Escobar instructed Letter to hold a press conference to detail his support for this politician. At the press conference, Letter explained to reporters that decent and concerned businessmen had given presidential candidate Alonso Lopez a donation equivalent to $800,000 to protest the extradition. The next day, it was in all the newspapers. In the Conservative Party, they were very pleased with the exposure of the meeting. Rodriguez Gacha said that for his part, along with other merchants, he had donated nearly $1 million to the conservatives. And as Letter notes, it was Gacha's bid that made the difference. The long-awaited election day arrived, and candidate Belisario Betancourt won by a wide margin. The new president said he would not visit Washington while he was president of the republic. For the Medellín Cartel, this was a firm and reassuring signal that the extradition treaty would not be implemented during his administration. The mad ravings of the big mouth. However, they rejoiced too early. The Americans, meanwhile, were not slumbering. They started with the cartel's most notorious figure, Carlos Leder. On March 11, 1983, Leder founded the National Ad Movement, a new political party with an ultranationalist bias and even with a threatening neo-Nazi spirit. The party considered its fundamental task to be the immediate termination of the U.S.-Colombian extradition agreement. At this time, the U.S. had already requested Colombia to extradite Leder, and a Supreme Court hearing was imminent. Norman's Cay Island had to be abandoned and would be stormed a little later, and all of Carlos's accounts were frozen. Among all those to be extradited, the American ambassador called Leder the number one figure. Aware of the threat, Leder sent his men to the U.S. State Department to probe the ground, and he himself met with a USDA agent in Colombia, offering to sell Norman's Cay to the U.S. for $5 million if they would close the case. You could use it as a military base, Leder said meaningfully. At the time, he was of course turned down. Leder's insolence knew no bounds. In late July, he gave an interview for Bogota Radio, saying that he had bought his islands in the Bahamas for more than $1 million. And since they have faithfully served the most profitable Colombian enterprises, he admitted to running a friend's transportation business without saying the word cocaine out loud. He claimed he wanted to represent the people in the Senate, represent the people of labor and the poorest of the poor. It is alleged that I have entered a secret conspiracy to the detriment of the United States. I will say no more. I intend to damage them until the expulsion law is repealed. Moreover, Leder acquired a printing press and a staff of journalists who produced a proclamation newspaper of the National Ad Movement, in which Carlos declared himself almost a messiah and offered to pay Colombia's national debt to the U.S., and declared the drug trade a crusade against capitalism. But the crazy, provocative bravado did not bear fruit. On September 2nd, 1983, the Supreme Court decided the case in favor of the United States, finding Leder extraditable. A warrant for his arrest was signed in Colombia, but Carlos got wind of it in time and fled. Nevertheless, after approving the order for Leder's extradition, the new Minister of Justice, Lara Bonilla, who would yet play his strategic role in the story, passed it to the president for his signature. Tranquilandia, the raid on the heart of the empire. Then, a major disaster befell El Mexicano. I've already mentioned the largest enterprise called Tranquilandia. It was deep in the jungle, and after openly supporting Betancourt on the campaign trail, Gotcha became a real hero and never attracted too much DEA attention. So no one would have ever found it if not for the ether needed to produce pure cocaine hydrochloride and a bunch of meticulous Americans. On February 9th, 1984, the entire cartel gathered at a disco club in the mountains above Medellín. One of the main distributors from Miami, who belonged to the Ochoa network, was celebrating the birth of a son. The godfather was Jorge Ochoa himself. The festivities went on for a week, and all the while the cartel leaders were discussing pressing problems. As always, they were concerned about expanding their markets, and they wanted to increase the number of routes and pilots in the ever-changing conditions. Their joint compound, called Tranquilandia, had already been operating in the jungle for 6 months, and now was producing up to 4,000 kilograms of the drug a month. Many tons of cocaine had accumulated in the forests, and the new complex required an uninterrupted supply and absorbed tons and tons of raw materials, the most important of which is ether. The Americans, after learning this simple fact, began to monitor the flow of ether imported into Colombia. They realized that a ban on the importation of ether would hit the producers very hard. So they went to a local legal ether buyer who was buying twice as much ether as was legally used in all of Colombia in a year, and fitted 2 barrels from the shipment with radio signaling devices. The first signal came from New Orleans, whence the barrels traveled to the vicinity of Barranquilla, directly to the famous Hacienda Veracruz, located in the vast domain of the Ochoa clan. After a while, the signal left Veracruz and was airlifted by airplane to somewhere to the south. And the next signal came from the impenetrable jungle in eastern Colombia. That was the destination. A 42-man extraction team went on their operation. They managed to take the narcos by surprise. No resistance was offered. Further passage revealed more and more of the Medellín Cartel's activities. Not just the main laboratory was found, but a real factory with a full cycle of cocaine production. It fed and clothed about 100 people. There were generators, showers, washers, and dryers. Not far from the strip, the police counted 305 drums of acetone, 363 of ether, 482 canisters of red gasoline, 133 canisters of jet fuel. In short, a huge stockpile of raw materials. According to a flight log abandoned by the runway, between December 1983 and February 1984, this makeshift airport received 15,253 tons of cocaine paste and base. And then the cocaine was discovered. 2 tons of cocaine in various aggregate states. Soon, journalists arrived, and Colombian television broadcast the military and a good half of the country's correspondents inspecting the largest cocaine shipment in history. That's when the name of the camp, Tranquilandia, was leaked. Next to it was Valandia, and even Valandia 2, which was under construction. Each of the camps probably belonged to different bosses. A guerrilla camp belonging to the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, was also discovered. Apparently, the guerrillas were guarding cocaine production. In half a month, 13.8 tons of cocaine turned to smoke, and with them 14 laboratories and camps, 7 airplanes, and 11,800 barrels of ether and other chemicals. Colombian authorities estimated that in 2 years, these laboratories had generated $1.2 billion in net income for the cocaine lords. After the raid, the DEA and Colombian authorities realized that the Medellín Cartel was no longer just collecting shipments from small home labs. The existence of Tranquilandia posed a challenge to the government. If it's possible to build one factory, it's not going to take the rest. Maybe there were dozens or hundreds of them already. What's more, the facts pointed to the fact that all of it belonged to the Medellín Cartel. The airstrip at Rancho Veracruz led directly to the Ochoa clan. But the biggest revelation was Rodriguez Gacha's involvement in the venture. He turned out to be a full co-owner of the laboratories found in the jungle. This was indicated by a crashed airplane found on one of the landing strips in the forest. The owner of the plane was El Mexicano's own brother. The next signal came from the town of Leticia, where a rumor was circulating that Rodriguez Gacha had gone completely bankrupt because of the Tranquilandia raid. It turns out that as early as mid-December 1983, he had begun moving paste and cocaine base from Peru to Tranquilandia and had invested enormous sums of money in laboratories. Rodriguez Gacha's financial collapse clearly confirmed that he was a partner in the Medellín Cartel. This is how the entire top of the criminal organization came to the attention of law enforcement. The fateful bullet and the escape to Panama. The raid had done the cartel undeniable damage. But does not end there. Lara Bonilla, the Minister of Justice, persistently attacks the aspiring Congressman Escobar in the political field, and he responds, so far within reason. The result of their fierce debate in the legal field was the departure of Pablo from the world of big politics in early 1984. It was the beginning of the end. First, Tranquilandia and the final exposure of the entire Medellín Cartel, then the revocation of Pablo's parliamentary immunity. Carlos Letter's constant exposure in the press, and his almost open confession to cocaine trafficking. The beautiful screen that the Medellín Cartel had spent so long building had been pulled back, exposing their bestial nature. It wasn't long before the bloodshed on the streets of Colombia began. On April 30th, Lara Bonilla was murdered in his car on his way home. Several hitmen were involved in the crime, of which only one survived. The chain of hiring these hitmen is so long that it's not far-fetched to investigate and catch the culprits. Both Letter and Ochoa were suspected, but in the end, it was likely an impulsive decision by Pablo Escobar, frustrated by his failure in big politics, who plugged in a chain of numerous gunmen in the service of the cartel. The war of the traffickers and politicians began that night. That night, April 30th, 1984, President Belisario Betancourt ordered a ruthless crackdown on both the bosses of the Medellín Cartel and their enemies, the Cali Cartel. Immediately, the decision to invoke the extradition treaty was made public. That same night, the criminals fled Colombia and arrived in Panama. To Carlos Leder and their accomplice, Panama's shadowy leader Manuel Noriega, who had been directly involved in their dealings since 1982, providing a staging point for transportation. Noriega took the exiles under his wing. He provided the cartel leaders with bodyguards and gave them useful advice. Under Noriega's patronage, the cartel conducted a double game with a long-range aim to restore its former power. On the one hand, the businessmen launched a huge laboratory in the Darien jungles of Panama. On the other, they were all eager to make peace with the Colombian government, in the hope that the old days would be forgotten and their sins forgiven. The Medellín bosses sent a long 6-page letter to Belisario Betancourt through an intermediary. They called this outstanding message a unilateral declaration, emphasized the honesty and frankness of their position, and asked the president to consider the possibility of their reunification with Colombian society. They offered to hand over all secret airfields and laboratories, dissolve the cartel, let their money circulate in Colombia, and cooperate with the government in campaigns to eradicate drug addiction. In return, the businessmen wanted Betancourt to lift the state of siege that had been imposed after Bonilla's assassination and agreed not to extradite to the U.S. criminals who had broken the law before that landmark letter. In other words, the cartel demanded amnesty. The country was offered a colossal bribe. The cartel members received no response from Betancourt or anyone else and continued to hide in Panama, gradually losing their millions. In Panama, the Medellín bosses found themselves defenseless, accompanied by misfortunes and high-profile scandals. It was becoming obvious that the cartel would have to get out of Panama. Both Escobar and Ochoa felt uneasy outside Colombia. Both knew that ultimately, the safest place would be at home, where they could always buy the patronage of the powerful and hire assassins to keep their enemies in fear. But Betancourt was not about to relent. He appointed another drug mafia fighter, Enrique Perejo Gonzalez, to replace Lara Bonilla as Minister of Justice. Perejo was inflexible like Lara Bonilla, but unlike the late minister, he could now count on Betancourt's support. By late summer, the U.S. had requested the extradition of more than 60 Colombian defendants in drug smuggling cases. Finally, on August 14th, a judge filed preliminary charges against 14 suspects in the murder of Lara Bonilla, and among them, the so-called masterminds of the crime, Pablo Escobar, the 3 Ochoa brothers, and Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha. The real war had just begun, and so the line was crossed. The state had declared war, and the men who thought themselves untouchable were now marked for death or extradition. From the sweltering jungles of Panama, they would plot their revenge, their paranoia growing with each passing day. This was the turning point, the moment the hunters became the hunted. What happens when an empire built on fear begins to fear for itself? The answer lies in a trail of betrayal, assassination, and political chaos that would stretch across continents. The next file is now open. Continue the investigation on your screen, and be sure to subscribe. The darkest chapters are yet to be written.